The Castle Nobody Ever Escaped is not merely a title for a campfire story or a sensationalist piece of historical fiction, but rather a stark, chilling reality that finds its truest and most terrifying expression in the heart of the medieval period, a millennium defined as much by its soaring cathedrals and chivalric codes as by its dark, damp, and inescapable dungeons. To understand the profound horror of this concept, one must first abandon the modern notion of a prison as a place of rehabilitation or even of structured punishment, and instead embrace the medieval understanding of incarceration, which was quite simply a state of living death, a prelude to the eternal torments of hell itself. And the castle, as the ultimate symbol of feudal power, became the most effective and dreaded instrument of this earthly damnation. The architectural genius of the medieval castle was, in its primary function, dedicated to keeping enemies out. But this same genius, when inverted, proved to be devastatingly effective at keeping prisoners in. And the very features that made a castle impregnable from the outside, its thick, sheer stone walls, its narrow, arrow-slit windows, its deep, water-filled moats, and its the physical isolation of these fortresses, often perched atop inaccessible crags or surrounded by treacherous marshes, meant that even if a prisoner managed to miraculously slip past the guards and the portcullis, he would find himself in a hostile, unknown landscape, with no provisions, no allies, and the certain knowledge that recapture would result in a punishment far worse than the original sentence, a punishment that often involved being broken on the wheel, drawn and quartered, or subjected to the slow, agonizing torture of being left to rot in a cage suspended from the castle walls. The history of Europe is a veritable tapestry woven with the threads of such dark places, and while many castles have a dark reputation, few are as infamous as the Château d'If, located on a tiny island off the coast of Marseille, which was made immortal by the writings of Alexandre Dumas, but whose real history is far more grim than the fictional adventures of the Count of Monte Cristo. For this fortress prison was a place of absolute despair, where prisoners were thrown into oubliettes, cells so named from the French word for forget, and into which men were lowered by rope and left to be forgotten, their only contact with the outside world being the occasional turnkey who would drop a meager portion of bread and water into the abyss below. The concept of the oubliette is perhaps the single most horrific innovation of the medieval prison system, because it was a space designed to erase a person from the world, a hole in the ground where the prisoner was stripped of their name, their identity, and their hope, leaving them to confront the rat-infested darkness and their own decaying sanity in utter solitude. And this is a fate that befell countless individuals, from disgraced knights and rebellious barons to unfortunate commoners who had fallen afoul of a local lord's capricious justice. The Tower of London, perhaps the most famous fortress prison in the world, is another prime example of this terrifying phenomenon. For while it served as a royal palace and a military stronghold, its primary function in the popular imagination and in historical fact was as a place of imprisonment, execution, and unending torment. And within its formidable walls, the very stones seemed to absorb the screams of the tortured, from the young princes in the tower who were mysteriously murdered and whose fate remains a haunting mystery, to the ill-fated Lady Jane Grey, who spent her final days in its cold chambers before being led to the block, and to the countless nameless prisoners who were subjected to the rack, the scavenger's daughter, and other ingenious devices of pain that were designed not to kill, but to prolong suffering and extract confessions. The inescapability of these places was not merely a matter of physical barriers, but was also a psychological weapon of immense power, because the sheer weight of the castle's history,
The knowledge that no one had ever escaped its clutches was a crushing burden on the prisoner's mind. And this psychological torment was often more devastating than the physical deprivation, as it eroded the will to live and replaced it with a passive acceptance of a terrible fate. And the guards and jailers, who were often drawn from the lowest and most brutal strata of society, actively cultivated this atmosphere of hopelessness, using their power to torment the prisoners with impunity, knowing that their superiors would never side with a condemned man against his keeper.
The medieval legal system itself was a labyrinth of arbitrary cruelty, where guilt was often presumed, and where justice was a commodity that could be bought and sold, leaving the poor and the powerless with no defense against the machinations of a powerful enemy. And this meant that a person could be thrown into a castle dungeon for the most trivial of reasons: a careless word spoken against a lord, a failure to pay a debt, or even a neighbor's malicious accusation. And once inside, the process of being forgotten was terrifyingly swift, as the bureaucratic machinery of the era was ill-equipped to track prisoners, and many were simply left to die of starvation, disease, or sheer neglect, their bones piling up in the darkness, adding their silent testimony to the horrors of the place. The condition of these dungeons was so unimaginably foul that they defy modern comprehension, for they were not merely dark, but were also cesspits of filth, where human waste, rotting food, and stagnant water combined to create a toxic atmosphere that bred disease and madness, and prisoners were often chained to the walls with heavy iron manacles, their limbs growing festering sores from the chafing of the metal, their bodies covered in lice and fleas, their lungs slowly filling with the damp miasmic air that seeped. The complete lack of light meant that the prisoners' sense of time was utterly destroyed, and they lived in a perpetual twilight or absolute blackness, unable to distinguish day from night. And this sensory deprivation was a form of torture in its own right, causing the mind to play tricks, conjuring fearsome phantoms, and driving many to the brink of insanity. And those who did not go mad were often reduced to a state of animalistic apathy, their human spirit extinguished, leaving behind only a hollow shell that responded to pain and hunger with a dull, mechanical reflex. The food, when it was provided, was barely edible, usually consisting of stale bread, rancid water, and occasionally a piece of putrid meat. A diet that was completely lacking in essential nutrients and which led to scurvy, rickets, and other deficiency diseases that caused the teeth to fall out, the bones to soften, and the skin to break out in painful ulcers. And this slow, agonizing decline was the fate of the majority of prisoners, for execution was often seen as a merciful release from the relentless misery of the dungeon.
However, the medieval period was not the only epoch in which castles served as the ultimate prisons. Indeed, the Renaissance and the early modern period saw a refinement and intensification of these practices, as rulers like Cesar Borgia and the Spanish Inquisition used castles as their primary instruments of state terror, transforming them into highly organized and bureaucratic engines of repression. And the infamous torture chambers of the Inquisition, located within castles across Spain and Italy, were equipped with the latest and most sophisticated instruments of pain, including the Iron Maiden, the Pear of Anguish, and the Strappado, all of which were designed to extract confessions that would justify the death sentence. And the victims of these inquisitions were often not heretics or criminals, but simply individuals who held property that the inquisitors coveted, or who had made powerful enemies within the ecclesiastical hierarchy. And the castle dungeon became the final, silent arbiter of their fate. The sheer variety of ways in which a castle could hold a prisoner was staggering. From the relatively comfortable, if still restrictive, chambers used for high-ranking hostages like captive kings, to the horrific water-filled pits known as wells, where prisoners were suspended by a rope and periodically lowered into the icy water until they nearly drowned, a process known as dunking, which was used as a form of torture and a method of execution. and these wells were often located deep within the castle's foundations, where the sound of dripping water and the screams of the prisoners would echo endlessly through the stone corridors, a constant reminder to the rest of the castle's inhabitants of the price of disobedience.
The famous fortress of Bran Castle in Transylvania, often linked to the Dracula legend, serves as a perfect example of how a castle's inescapable nature contributed to its terrifying reputation. For though Vlad the Impaler may not have ever truly been a count who lived in that specific castle, the real history of the region is one of brutal warlords in dark prisons, where impalement was a favored method of punishment, and where the remote cliff-top location of the fortress meant that a prisoner would find it virtually impossible to flee without plunging to a gruesome death on the rocks below. And the legend itself is a testament to the deep-seated human fear of being trapped in such a place, a fear that transcends specific history and taps into a primal, universal dread of confinement.
Even in the more civilized periods of the 18th and 19th centuries, the castle prison did not disappear. It simply evolved into newer forms, such as the infamous prison hulks of England, which were rotting ships anchored in muddy estuaries, where prisoners were chained in the dark holds, and the conditions were so similar to a medieval dungeon that a visit to one would have been a journey back in time. And this continuity of suffering demonstrates that the concept of the inescapable prison is not a relic of a barbaric age, but a persistent feature of human civilization, a dark reflection of our capacity for cruelty and control. The Bastille in Paris, which was stormed at the start of the French Revolution, was a castle prison that had come to represent the absolute tyranny of the monarchy. But its reality was less heroic and more grim. For while it housed only a few prisoners by the end of the 18th century, it had spent centuries being a place of arbitrary imprisonment, where a simple lettre de cachet from the king could consign a person to its depths for an indefinite period, without trial, without charge, and without hope of release. And the prisoners who emerged from it were often broken in mind and body, their families having long since forgotten them, their fortunes dissipated, and their lives irrevocably ruined. And this fate was so feared that the very name Bastille became a synonym for oppression and the arbitrary abuse of power.
The psychological horror of the castle prison was amplified by the constant fear of something far worse than mere imprisonment, for the dungeon was often merely an anteroom to the torture chamber, a place where the prisoner would be subjected to unspeakable agonies until they confessed to whatever crime their accusers had invented. And the instruments of this torture were not crude implements, but rather highly engineered tools of immense precision, designed to break specific bones, to stretch the body to the breaking point, or to burn the flesh without causing immediate death. And the prisoner's torment would be carefully calibrated to elicit the maximum amount of pain and fear, with the goal of achieving total submission. And these tortures were often conducted in a public manner, within the castle courtyard, where the screams of the victims would serve as a terrifying warning to the populace of the consequences of defiance.
The cold, damp climate of the northern European castles was itself a merciless enemy, as the thick stone walls did not keep out the winter's chill, but instead absorbed it, turning the dungeons into freezing ice boxes where prisoners would huddle together for warmth, their breath forming clouds in the air, their fingers and toes slowly succumbing to frostbite. And the result was a slow, agonizing death from exposure, a death that was all the more cruel because it was so prolonged, as the prisoner's body would gradually shut down, their mind clouding over, their last conscious thought being a desperate, futile prayer for a quick end that would never come. In contrast, the southern European castles offered no respite, for they were sweltering ovens in the summer, their small, unventilated cells becoming unbearable furnaces where prisoners would die of heat stroke and dehydration, their bodies swelling and their skin cracking. And the stench of decay and suffering would be overwhelming, a nauseating miasma that clung to the clothes and skin of the jailers, marking them as men who lived with death every day.
The question of escape, when it was even attempted, was a near impossible task,
as the elaborate system of locks, keys, and multiple portcullises made any physical breach of the security virtually impossible, and the few successful escapes that are recorded in history, such as the daring escape of the French nobleman Jean de la Rivière from the Château de Loches in 1418, are notable precisely because they are so exceedingly rare, and they usually require the assistance of someone on the inside, a bribed guard or a sympathetic servant. And even then, the escape was often a frantic, bloody affair, with the escapees facing the constant risk of a crossbow bolt in the back or a sudden fall into a hidden pit. And for every one successful escape, there were hundreds of desperate and failed attempts, which resulted in the prisoners being recaptured and subjected to even more brutal punishments, such as having their Achilles tendons severed so they could never run again, or being hung in an iron cage from the castle wall to die a slow death of exposure and starvation, their bodies becoming a grim spectacle for the passers-by, a warning that the castle's embrace was indeed eternal. The eventual decline of the feudal castle prison is not a story of moral enlightenment or a sudden outpouring of humanitarian sentiment, but rather a pragmatic shift in the nature of power itself, as the monarchies began to centralize their authority and the state took over the administration of justice from the local lords. And this led to the development of the modern prison system, which, while still brutal and often inhumane, at least operated on a set of codified rules and was subject to some form of oversight. But the legacy of the medieval castle prison, the idea of a place so dark and so inescapable that it is the very embodiment of despair, has never truly left our collective imagination, and it survives in our literature, our films, and our deepest, most primal fears.
The darkest prison in history is therefore not a single location, but a cumulative historical experience, a testament to the ingenuity of human cruelty and the resilience of the human spirit. But it is also a warning, a reminder that the line between civilization and barbarism is a thin and fragile one, and that the high walls and strong towers that we build to protect ourselves can just as easily be turned into instruments of our own destruction. And the phrase, "the castle nobody ever escaped," is a harrowing epitaph for the countless thousands of souls whose names are lost to history, who entered those stone fortresses as living, breathing individuals and left them only as bones and dust, their final resting place a nameless corner of a forgotten dungeon, their only legacy the silent, enduring power of the stones that kept them forever trapped. And so we must always remember these places, not as romantic ruins or tourist attractions, but as the terrifying monuments to the darkest parts of our shared past. And we must ask ourselves what we have truly learned if we continue to build such prisons, both literal and metaphorical, in our own time. And we must conclude that the castle nobody ever escaped was not a prison of bricks and mortar alone, but a prison of the human condition, a fortress of fear and power that we are all in our own way trying to escape and finding ourselves tragically and hopelessly confined.